recorded at Get a Grip Studios in Toronto, Canada, a Get a Grip management production and in association with the Get a Grip on Lighting podcast. Financially supported by the good folks at the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, this is Restoring Darkness podcast.
This episode of Restoring Darkness is brought to you by Evluma. If you're serious about contributing to the reduction of light pollution, go to evluma.com, hover over products, and click on Dark Sky Friendly Lighting. Both the OmniMax and AreaMax lights are International Dark Sky Association certified. The warmer color temperatures of the OmniMax reduce the more easily scattered blue wavelengths, which contribute to glare and sky glow. With AreaMax lights, you get full cutoff, which also means no uplight and a significantly reduced contribution to sky glow. And all of Evluma's outdoor lighting product lines come with dimmable drivers for even more control. If your customer is looking for dark sky-friendly fixtures with energy savings while still meeting the demands of decorative lighting, look no further than Evluma. Evluma, illuminating the pursuit of dark skies.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining us here on Restoring Darkness. If you're watching this and not listening, you'll notice that I have a new green screen background, beautiful starry sky there. And we're making a lot of format changes to the show, so get ready for that. It's going to be a new show and completely new format coming in probably June, Scott? I'm looking at my producer. We're going back and forth, but we're changing a lot of things. But today, we're honored to have Mike Hawtin. Mike is head of nature recovery projects at North York Moors National Park, a protected upland landscape and international dark sky reserve in the north of England, as well as delivery of landscape-scale nature recovery projects within the Conservation and Climate Change Department. Mike is also the lead officer for Dark Skies at the National Park Authority. Mike's initial involvement with Dark Skies at the National Park started 6 years ago with a project to further develop a Dark Skies Festival and to encourage businesses to collaborate and to become Dark Skies friendly. Mike oversaw the application to become an international dark sky reserve from inception to successful designation. As well as the benefits for stargazing and the rural economy, the National Park Authority works actively to protect and improve nocturnal habitats and, and connectivity through planning policies and a dark skies lighting improvement funding scheme. We got money. Mike also set up a number of protected landscapes to share best practices and supports those on their respective dark sky journeys. The North York Moors National Park is also part of a national forum looking to influence government on lighting policy, which has started with the All-Parliamentary Group for Dark Skies. Welcome to Restoring Darkness, Mike Hawtin.
Hello there. It's a nice long introduction.
Yes, well, it's we kind of just get the scope out there and let people sort of settle into what we're going to talk about here. And first of all, I'd like to say congratulations on the designation. When did you guys officially get it?
So we've had it just over 2 years. So December just gone, we had it 2 years. I'd say really the work started probably a good 6 years, if not more, before then. So it was quite a long journey from having an idea that we might want to become a dark sky reserve to actually going through, the whole application process, all of the background that's needed to show that we are a dark enough area to be an international dark sky reserve. And I have to say that the coverage we've had because of that has been incredible. And year on year, the interest, whether it's from the public or from the press, just never seems to reduce. It just picks up all the time. And I'm really pleased to say that this year we've seen a marked change in that interest. And now it's not just about the festival and the enjoyment. It really is about light pollution. So people are really sitting up and taking notice of this.
We often talk about restoring darkness and preserving night on this show as something, as a movement, and it's gaining momentum. And we want to restore darkness where we have light pollution, and we want to preserve it where night is pristine. And so, you can see the public is starting to grab onto this issue. One of the things that I think is changing, and you tell me from what you've heard in the publicity and the news from visitors and all that. Are people starting to consider light pollution as pollution and not a metaphor?
Yes, almost certainly. Whenever we talk about dark skies, whenever we run a presentation, And I did a quick tally actually for our IDA annual report, and I think I'd done something like 100 visits to different organisations to talk about dark skies with them over the period of a couple of years. And the great thing about dark skies is that there's not just one single reason why they're important. So
Mm.
we look at culture and mindfulness. We look at nature. We talk
Mm.
about human health. We talk about energy usage, the rural economy, and education. And in every single room, at least one of those things will appeal to somebody, even the hardest nosed individual. If they're not bothered about culture, they're not interested in wildlife. They're probably bothered about their own health or about, in the current climate, about energy usage.
Mm.
And so we're certainly starting to see people really sit up and take note and think about all of those elements. Not just one single element. Um, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword at the moment, we feel, with the kind of the energy crisis, if we want to call it that. In that, on the one hand, the upside is people are really considering whether they should be leaving the lights on,
Mm-hmm.
all night.
Mm-hmm.
We have lots of focus at the moment, as I'm sure all places around the world do, on carbon reduction, on
Mm-hmm.
how we do that, how we reduce energy. And there's a lot of discussion in this country about home insulation and how that's the single biggest win that the government could make in terms of reducing
Wrong.
carbon footprint.
I disagree with that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And there are lots of different obviously contributors to that. But if we look at light pollution, for example, it's a little bit tongue in cheek to say, but it's one of the easiest forms of pollution to solve. You can solve it at the flick of a
We
switch.
have all the technology. We have all the. It's not a research and development question. It's not even an engineering question. It's not like the technology already exists. It's available for sale at your local electrical distributor. You just have to choose it.
Yep.
I've been advocating on this show, Mike, and not to interrupt you, but I just am very passionate about what you're saying, and I just want to kind of throw this at you. I think the lighting industry has a moral. We've created so much light pollution in the last 10 years. It's getting. I think I heard Ruskin on an interview with Randy Reed, Ruskin Hartley, who is for those listening is the executive director of Dark Skies International. I heard him in an interview saying it's been going up for 10% a year or something like that for a long time.
Scary.
Yeah, it is scary. That's a scary number. And then you talk about the lighting industry. I think should change focus away from circadian, human health and wellness, and all this sort of stuff, and say energy efficiency, and say, you know what, our number one priority is to reduce light pollution or eliminate light pollution. And that you would get the energy savings, you would get the human health and wellness, you would get the circadian and all this sort of stuff. And the lighting industry is kind of like all over the place with these different issues. And when it comes to the outdoor piece, Mike, I think that they should change their focus away from these individual elements, energy efficiency, carbon, and just say, we want to reduce light pollution. We want to eliminate light pollution. And if they did that as the sole focus, everything else would dovetail into that. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I also think, though, we've got to consider, certainly here in the UK, how would we best gain traction with government? So, we've looked
Mm,
at all of the reasons that I outlined earlier why protecting dark skies are important. We're not going to get any kind of traction if we say it's about everybody's right to see a starry sky, because that just won't cut through as far as government
I
legislation is
agree.
concerned. It has to be about some really serious things like, there's a huge drive at the moment for us for nature recovery and local nature recovery strategies.
Hmm.
We can't rule lighting out of that. We talk about connectivity and hedgerows and woodland creation and improving that connectivity. We've got to be just as serious about that at night. We look at some of the light pollution maps, and we look at, there's a transport corridor, a
Hmm.
motorway in between the North York Moors National Park and the Yorkshire Dales National Park. And if you look at the light pollution map, year on year, that's just getting worse and worse. And if we're not
Sure.
careful, we end up cutting off two national parks from a connectivity perspective.
Mm,
And that's the message that we need to get through. So it needs to be about things like nature. It needs to be about things like carbon reduction, because they're the prime focus of the government at the moment. And if we can latch onto that, I'm not
Mm.
saying it's necessarily the simplest of messages, but if we can latch onto initiatives that are already there, then we're more likely to cut through than to start something totally new and try and push it through
See, that's where I
ourselves.
think this Society for Light and Lighting I could come in and help out and say, look, we do need electric light at night. Yes, nobody's advocating for no electric light at night. That's never been advocated for by anyone that I've ever interviewed on this show. But what we're saying is that we have technology that reduces the pollution drastically and still provides the light that people need. We're just not doing that right now. One thing that made me sad that you said is that um, I do think being able to see a beautiful sky filled with stars is a human right. And I think we denying our cultural heritage as a species. I mean, every historical building that you come across is orientated to the night sky. You have buildings, this is where the star comes in and they see the pyramids are orientated to different constellations and all this sort of stuff. Like, our heritage is up there as much as it is anywhere else.
Oh yeah, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's not important. Yeah, I've been lucky enough, as I'm sure you have, to sit through some amazing, inspiring talks by indigenous populations from around the world, and
Beautiful
access
example.
to night
Yeah.
skies are absolutely fundamental to their culture.
Mm.
And the passing on of stories, and perhaps in the West, in certain areas, we've kind of lost that link. And so it's maybe not quite as high up the agenda list, but
Mm.
I fully agree with you. I think it is a fundamental right. We just have to be savvy about how best to get that traction. And ultimately, I'm in favour of however we protect dark skies, however we can cut through quickest and most effectively, is the route that we need to take.
Economics, you mentioned you said lots of publicity, lots of interest. Has that paid off at the cash till? Like, have you guys seen an increase in park attendance and fees, and is it paying for itself in some way?
Yeah, so we haven't got really up-to-date figures, but we've got some interesting stats that just put things into kind of context. So pre-COVID, as we were, and we are still building our Dark Skies Festival, it's incredibly popular. We have well over 100 events over a 2-week period, and they can
Mm.
be anything from stargazing, astrophotography, mindfulness walks, yoga at night, everything you can think of. Really designed to get people outside at night. And interestingly, just sidetracking slightly, thinking about a cultural aspect
Mm.
in a slightly non-obvious way, we have lots of folklore in the national park around ghosts and ghoulies,
Sure.
out at night, and fundamentally, these things were basically created to discourage people from being out at night,
Mm.
where they would see people that were up to no good, so the smugglers, and so that
Sure.
there are lots of stories that are still interlinked with dark skies, even though it's not necessarily the way that we look at it. Um, in terms of the economics, 2019, over that 2-week period, for the businesses that took part, it was worth about £500,000 to the rural economy.
Hmm.
Now, to put that into perspective, and that's a conservative estimate. That's what we could grasp. We couldn't tell what they then went off and spent in a shop or this or that, during their stay.
That's
But
direct. That's the direct
yeah,
benefit. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
But Northumberland National Park, who are way ahead of us in time scale,
Sure.
probably about 10 years ahead of us, it's worth £25 million a year to their rural economy.
Wow.
Um, Now, that doesn't tell the whole story, because it's worth £25 million a year at a time when businesses typically don't have much income.
Hmm.
So typically in what we call the shoulder season, the winter, the darker winter months, where businesses are quiet,
Yes.
they're searching
Yes.
around for extra revenue, and this just naturally fills that gap.
Hmm.
So it's not just the pure figure; it's about the fact it fills in that gap, and also doesn't put any more pressure on the already busy summer
Mm-hmm.
infrastructure.
Sure.
So it just ticks everybody's boxes.
Yeah, for sure. Now, in terms of you mentioned the politics side of it, and one of the things that I've been worried about. Now, I'm Canadian. I'm not American, but Canada is very close to the U.S., and so I'm aware of the politics down there. And we have our own problems here in Canada, but I'm worried. I've always worried that this issue will become a political issue, where one side will start screaming, "You want to take away people's electric light, and they need it," and the other side saying, "You're not, you're destroying this night sky," and they use it to divide, and they use it to create fear or to shame people. I noticed that in your bio it said all party parliamentary group. I love that. How did you guys accomplish that? How did you bring all the people together?
So it wasn't necessarily something that we started. We have a number of these groups within kind of politics in the UK, and all party parliamentary is, as it says, it isn't one particular party that's driving this agenda. There are members of that group from across all different political parties, and as is the case in many situations, you have to start with one individual who's quite passionate about
Mm,
this. So we have a particular member who will then start to try and gather interest, and then we'll start to look around and gather information. And the best source of that information really was starting with the dark sky reserves that existed,
hmm
and then off the back of that, finding out that all those dark sky reserves and a number of other protected landscapes are already talking to each other and already have all the answers really that are needed
mm,
for government to come up with policies. And so that resulted in this 10-part plan. Just all of the basics really, and designed to show that it's not absolutely not about taking away light at night.
mm.
It's about responsible, sensitive use of light at night. And I mean, a good example of this, I would definitely use the word innocence in most cases, and I'll give everybody the benefit of the doubt to begin with,
hmm
rather than ignorance. And so, I don't want to name
I
names,
love
but
that, by the way. I love that. That's a perfect way to
yeah,
put it. Yeah.
but as a member of the public, I wrote to my local MP. Not trying to lobby through my role as a national park, because we're not to do that, but wrote to my local MP to ask him to consider joining the all-party parliamentary group for dark skies, and I got a stock response, and the stock response was that if the local MP joined every APPG that everybody wanted them to join, they'd hardly have any time left to do anything else. So, I can accept that. And I guess you have to understand that they probably need to look at these invites and see which are the ones they feel they can make most kind of impact, and bring the most benefit to. So that kind of it went a little bit quiet, but then we opened a star hub up at one of our national park centres. So it's not so grand as being an observatory, but it's a warm room with like a dry stone wall, lay back benches, big circle where you can put all the scopes out.
Mm,
People can lay back and watch the stars while they're waiting, and it's become quite a focal point for us. And the press picked up on it, and so did our local MP, and wanted to come along, and have a look and talk
sure.
to us and see what was going on. So we took the opportunity for me to roll up with my presentation to talk about all the work that we're doing. And within 48 hours, the NP had signed up to the APPG.
Awesome.
Because unless you get to talk to people, the
Sure.
misconception is it's about turning everybody's lights off.
Yes.
And when you're an MP who's responsible for the rural economy, for businesses, for residents, you have to be careful about what you're being seen to be promoting.
Sure. Of course.
But once you get that message across, and I would say, I said I've maybe done 100 presentations. In all honesty, in all of those presentations to thousands of people, I've had one person tell me it was a complete and utter load of nonsense. He didn't use the word nonsense; it was a bit stronger than that. But
Sure.
but I'll replace that word.
Sure.
And so that really does tell me you're pushing on an open door with this message, that people really do get it
Mm.
once you have a chance to talk to them about it.
You hear the dialogue between our political classes in all the English-speaking Western nations, and it's a real turnoff, the discourse. When you listen to them talk about the other person's opinion and all this sort of stuff. And I love the way that you've committed to persuasion and convincing and laying out the case for this very carefully, and waiting. I understand, like, if you're an MP, and we have MPs here in Canada, it's the same terminology we use. You're very busy, actually. It's a job, and you have a lot of people asking you for things, and so you get these stock answers back. But that doesn't mean that you give up. Each one of those requests builds momentum in the movement. Every time someone calls their MP and says, "Hey, have you thought about, the national parks, wherever, what they're doing with, with the night sky there, and have you been there?" And every time you do that, it pushes the movement forward, and it's gaining momentum. And so I urge people, sometimes people latch on, like you said, to this. I know this now, so people that don't are ignorant, and I don't like that starting point. You know, Other people have their own lives; they're very busy. They have their own concerns. They have, maybe they sell light bulbs every day like me, and there's some issue I should be aware of that I'm not aware of right now. And when I come across it, hopefully, I can be convinced and persuaded. And I think that, that perspective that you've adopted is the most effective. And although people have to be patient with it, it's the best way to get through to people is to persuade them, Mike. And so I'm very glad that's happening. In terms of England, so England's a separate jurisdiction from the UK, or is it England and
Po-
Scotland are
po-
together?
Yeah, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
So
Um,
they're all under the same. There's the same. It's the same government in London that is in charge of all the dark skies in the UK, or is there a separate government in Scotland that does it, and one in Northern Ireland
it,
and
it,
Wales?
it's separate. So Wales and Scotland are separate, and actually, it's not quite as easy to say that the government are in charge of the dark sky reserves because we're effectively a government funded organisations, and there are lots of national parks around the UK. Some of them have dark sky reserve designations, some of them don't. Some of them either haven't got round to it and are on the start of that journey. Some of them, sadly, are national parks that are pretty much surrounded, if not already being infiltrated by artificial light at night, such that they would never get dark
Mm.
sky reserve status. So yes, we're DEFRA funded, but each national park is generally speaking in charge of their own kind of destiny. There are management plans, the way that they manage the national park itself, and national parks typically are made up, are not necessarily that they're not owned by the national park. Um, some of them have large parts in ownership, but
Hmm.
the majority don't. So we have to work with landowners, with organisations to bring them along on this journey.
So there's
So we have
private property within the park.
it's predominantly private property.
And so how is
Um,
it dealing with the landowners? Are they on board? Are they excited about this? And do you have
so,
resistance from
so
them?
yeah, no resistance or none yet. Touch wood.
Oh.
What we have is, or what we had to do is quite a lot of consultation up front.
Mm.
So the difference between a dark sky reserve and a dark sky park, typically a dark sky park is under single ownership, land
Hmm.
ownership, and a
Sure.
dark sky reserve is under multiple ownership. So we've had to engage with, consult with Forestry Commission, National Trust, Wildlife Trusts, Ministry of Defence, as well as other private landowners,
Hmm.
and really get this message across that it's
Wow.
not about plunging people into darkness. It's about using light properly. And the best vehicle for kind of illustrating that for us has definitely been demonstration projects. So we've worked with property owners more recently, and I think the reason we're sat here talking is off the back of a fairly large project um, being delivered by the Mexborough Estate, one of our big landowners, in Hornby Village, um, to convert the whole village to be dark sky friendly, to have dark sky friendly lighting. So village halls, pubs, little shops, and a few farms, and also all the residential properties and accommodation providers. Now, although that sounds relatively easy to do with a
It
single
sounds
landowner,
impossible to do, actually. I'm sorry. Like, I sell lighting every day, and I'm considered an expert. I do multiple lighting podcasts, and I have a very difficult time selling this type of equipment to people. I am so excited to hear that you've done entire villages. How the heck did you do that?
well, the It sounds easy because the whole village is owned by the estate. So
Mm-hmm.
most people there are tenants, they all rent their properties. But what we're really keen to ensure is that we don't just use a landowner to ride roughshod over
Sure.
the tenants and say, you like it or lump it, you'll get the light that we say. What
Mm.
we wanted to ensure is that we talk to the property owners, we talk to the business owners and say, okay, we're going to try this. And if we don't get it right, we'll tweak it, we'll change it. Because what we want every single one of those property owners to do is to talk to other people and say, my lighting's fantastic.
Yeah.
And that's the way we spread that message. And we've got some great images now from farm projects, from visitor centres where we've converted the lighting. And when you're sat in front of somebody trying to explain what you mean, there's no better way to do that than to just show them before and after images
Sure.
of horrendous glaring floodlights replaced with really
Sure.
nice, well targeted.
And look, the lighting that's done this way is better. It's so much nicer, actually. It's more beautiful. Now let me ask you: who had to pay? Did the tenants pay? Did the landlord pay? Was there subsidies? Tell me a little bit about the execution of it on the financial side.
Yeah, so we have a bit of a sliding scale as far as the lighting improvement scheme is concerned. And what I should say is where the money comes from.
Okay.
So in the national park, we don't have too many big developments, as you might imagine. Large developments
Mm-hmm.
are typically not necessarily welcomed in the national park, although we can't turn away from the potential economic benefits to local employment and the like.
Sure.
So we have a couple of largish developments. One's been here for a number of years, 20 plus years, and it was a potash mine. Um, and now it's a polyhalite mine, so polyhalite fertilizer. And then more recently, we had a planning application for the same for a new polyhalite mine. And so what we have in the UK, and you may have similar things over there, is we have what are called Section 106 payments.
Mm-hmm.
So these payments are made by the developer to an authority. So in our case, the National Park Authority, but in other cases, it could be a town council or a parish council. And the
Sure.
money is to compensate for the impacts of the development. And in the case of something like a town council, that can typically be spent on whatever the town council sees fit to offset
Mm-hmm.
that. But in the case of the national park, we worked very hard on identifying the specific categories of impact that a mine development would have.
Mm-hmm.
And they are things like, impact on the landscape, impact on the natural environment, impact on tranquility. And tranquility is the category in which lighting sits.
Mm-hmm.
So we have an amount of money to be spent on not just maintaining, but improving tranquility. It's not just about the status quo, it's about using that money to improve things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, actually, the mine is still in its development phase, in its construction phase, but once it goes into operational phase, it's quite a unique design. So they don't have big towers. All the winding is horizontal underground, so there's limited landscape impact, and their lighting will have to be best of the best. They'll have to make sure, and we will make sure that lighting is absolutely best in class, because we can't have payments being made elsewhere
Mm-hmm.
to compensate for an organization that doesn't get it, or a business that doesn't get it right.
Sure.
But of course, through the construction phase, they have to have lots of light to do the various, big construction um, elements of the project. That's not to say we don't visit twice a year to look at the lighting and make sure they're constantly making improvements. But there's obviously going to be a bigger impact during construction than there will
Mm-hmm.
be
For sure.
during the operational phase.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the money comes from, and it isn't a scheme whereby anybody can apply for a light bulb for an existing fixture in the north of the park and a single light on a property in the south of the park, because that would make no discernible improvement.
Mm-hmm.
So we look at strategically important locations. We look at bigger locations. We work with landowners that can make improvements on clusters of properties. It
Mm.
could be big farms. It could be a whole valley. Working with the National Trust, there's a valley at Bransdale, and they have a lot of tenant farmers there. And we've got a rolling program now, farm by farm, of improving their lighting.
Hmm.
And similarly at Hornby, we looked at that in its entirety and said, can we come up with a program that will allow us to change all of those lights? Now, in some cases, it could be a single pub. It could be a large pub on the ridge of a valley,
Sure.
intrinsically dark area, and we really want to improve that lighting. So we'd be prepared to pay up to 100% of installation
Wow.
and equipment and fixtures, sorry, to make changes. In other cases, with a landowner, for instance, we come to an agreement where they may pay the install, we may pay the fixture costs, or somewhere in between on that sliding scale. If it's a property on the edge of a large village, or we've got one town that's partly in the national park, well, clearly that's not going to make a huge difference if we change a few buildings on the edge of a town.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be at the lower end of the scale in terms of our financial contribution. But we have flexibility to do whatever is needed to make changes where those changes are going to make the biggest difference.
So you've rank ordered them. So you got your lowest fruit at the top, and you got a scale going down. You have financial incentives, in some cases up to 100% of the project cost, and depending on its importance, I guess, to the park. Is that how it's ranked? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep.
And then who do you have that's executing for you? Do you have recommended specifiers that are trained in this kind of lighting? Like, who's actually going there and making the specification for these folks?
So what we've been quite careful to do is we could have gone out and we could have worked with single businesses and gone out to tender, because from a procurement regulations perspective, we'd have to go out to tender if we were recommending a specific organisation, either from a lighting fixtures perspective or from an install perspective.
Sure.
But we didn't want to do that.
You can't be endorsing a manufacturer or a business. Yeah, I understand.
No, we don't want to do that. But what we want to do is bring as many businesses along with us as we possibly can. And the biggest difference that I've found is, first of all, talking to the local installers. So I may start talking to, so we've got, maybe a riding stable.
Sure.
And they've got a lot of light. There's a lot of value in racehorses, and there's
Sure.
security concerns. And, we can put security to one side for a minute, because, we obviously will have different views on, light isn't lots of light doesn't improve security. But anyway, I'll leave that to one side. But before even going down the path of making any changes, we'll talk to the installer that typically does all their work for them, and get that installer on board so that they understand why we're doing what we're doing. Because that one installer will then go to 10 times as many jobs as I can ever get to.
Yeah, of course.
And they'll start to push out that message. And it's not just the installer. So the installer could be quite a large business. It could maybe have 10, 20 employees all going out installing. It could be a man in a van that's just, one chap who he's a sole trader, and that's what he does. He does electrical installation. But we've also got local suppliers. Some of them are larger suppliers who are part of a national chain, but in charge of what they stock locally. Or we've got a local business electrical retailer. So they'll install fridges and install TVs, and
Sure.
they sell lights as well. And those two businesses are totally on board now. So the agreement we've got, which is amazing, is one of them is going to take out all of their current display of outside lights, because they're not dark sky friendly. And they're going to replace it with a display of dark sky friendly lights with a backdrop that is a starry sky.
Amen.
And the national park logo on top of the backdrop, and a stack of leaflets on the counter explaining why protecting dark skies. And so we could have gone one route and just be, single supplier, single installer, but we'd miss out on the ability to spread that message.
You're excluding the entrepreneurship, which is the best part, right? You build the movement, and I love the fact that the business is paying for their own showroom, and now people can come to the business and be educated about this. You guys can't replicate that. No matter how many people you hire, more people are going to be going into a lighting business. This is why I often advocate that we need the lighting industry to really embrace the issue. And I try to tell, this is not about selling less lights. It's about selling more lights. More expensive lights, better lights. This is, we need to turn this issue into a Gucci suit, Mike, where lighting companies are like, come on, you got to go dark skies. Everyone's going darkness restoration now, night preservation. What's wrong with you? You know what I'm saying? That's so wonderful to hear. That's one of the greatest developments I've heard since I started this show, to be honest with you, Mike, that there's a business in the UK that has set up has removed their display of outdoor lighting and put in a display of fixtures that are going to preserve night in the park. I love it. Absolutely love it, Mike.
Yeah, and it has to happen on many levels. You know, what we want is we want local people to be able to buy locally because that benefits the
Of
local
course.
economy. But
Yes.
not everybody does that. So we've got another chap who's set up an online site selling only dark sky friendly lighting,
Oh, it's so
and
amazing.
he's been involved in the kind of the national group of protected landscapes who get together once or twice a year to talk about all of these issues. And he set up this online site. So whether you want to buy online, if that's your preference,
Mm.
or whether you want to go down to the local retailer, both bases are covered.
This is the most exciting story I've heard, Scott. Since the most practical application of all of this, I've spoken to researchers and designers and all sorts of groups of people, but I love this measurement. How are you guys measuring the results? Like, how do you know what you're doing is effective?
So there are, in theory, there's a scientific way and there's a non-scientific way. You'd think that the scientific way would be the best, but actually, probably the best way is to just look and see the difference between before and after.
Mm.
Now we do take readings. We have a group of volunteers who've got the little SQM meters, and we've got over a dozen of those. They'll take meter readings throughout the year, typically in the darker months, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And we're building up. I mean, we're only just into our third year, so we're building up a record of those readings. We've also got access to the light pollution map. But what we've got to realise is that you can't just look year on year and say, well, it got worse this year, so therefore light pollution is much worse, because there are so many other factors.
Mm-hmm.
Atmospheric conditions play a huge part. We could
Sure.
have had a particularly wet winter, lots of moisture in the air. You know,
Mm.
that can impact the readings. We could also just miss those darkest nights. You know, the volunteers weren't available on those nights, so they couldn't get out, or they weren't out late enough.
Mm.
So what we're doing is we're adding to that with some fixed meter locations.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got 5 at the moment, and we're looking to add another 3.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll have 8 permanent meters dotted around the national park, which are monitoring the skies every single night of every single day.
Hmm.
And that will allow us to build up a lot of data. But then what we've got to do is we've got to interpret that data. We've got to overlay whether it was a
Sure.
cloudy night, was it a clear night,
Sure.
and really get some meaningful information and results out of that. And I think what we've then got to do is we've got to look at, it's probably going to be a minimum rolling 5-year period of looking at whether any changes
Mm.
have happened. Because as I say, if you look 1 year to the next, you can be fooled into thinking either things have significantly improved or got significantly worse. And in
Mm-hmm.
1 year, that's not going to be the case.
Yeah, there needs to be again. There's so many confounding factors that are involved with it that you need time. You just need time and measurement, and then things will start to the smoke will start to clear, so to speak, as you move forward with the data. I wanted to and we're almost coming up on, can you believe it, 40 minutes here. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this tranquility thing, word that you mentioned, and oftentimes on this show silence is sort of a proxy for darkness. The two kind of go together, even in our spiritual minds and in our archetypally thinking about it. Like even the background behind me, that area is also silent while being dark, right? The tranquility. How did that become a factor in assessment? Like tranquility, it sounds like something so unscientific, impossible to measure. It's almost a feeling, right? It's not even tranquility.
Sure.
How did that become the as a part of your assessment process or something?
I think it probably certainly started pre Dark Sky Reserve application. So we did, as a National Park Authority, we did what we call a tranquility mapping
Mm.
exercise. And we looked at areas of the national park that are a minimum distance away from a road or a postcode, an inhabited area.
Mm-hmm.
And we use that to influence future policy decisions on what we would or wouldn't allow in terms of development in certain areas. So if an area was intrinsically tranquil, we wouldn't allow something to
Who
be
decided
developed in
that?
that area. Well, that was the mapping. So the mapping
Okay.
was, if it's in an area that is I can't remember if it was 1 or 2 kilometers away from the nearest road
Hmm.
or from the nearest inhabited property,
Hmm.
then it was classed as tranquil. And
Okay.
if you then go and dump something in that that affects that tranquility, be it a house, be it I don't know, thinking of examples now, be it an agricultural barn or a shed
Sure.
or something that increases activity in that area, then because it was classed as tranquil, there would be we would be stricter on what could happen there. Fast forward, well, not fast forward actually, probably in parallel with that, we were having the discussions through the planning application stage for the polyhalite mine. And what were the impacts of the mine? Well, the impacts of the mine were noise and light. Now, at the time, looking back, perhaps we could have done something slightly different. But at the time, the key thing that we identified as an impact on tranquility for the mine development and then in life was light.
Mm.
And so that's why a proportion of that of the Section 106 payments is ring fenced to be spent on reducing light pollution every year for 100 years from the granting of planning permission for the mine
Hmm.
development.
Hmm.
Now, the hope is, or my hope is, that we don't have to rely on that for 100 years, because
Yeah.
I really do hope that inside of 100 years we've got some legislation which helps control lighting rather than just us trying to spend money to do it every year. But we know we've got we've got money to do some really good work and to develop those demonstration projects which give us those images to show people what it's all about, and keep stressing this every time I can. I start every meeting that I go to, every presentation, that I am not the bloke who's come to tell you to turn all your lights off, but I am the guy who's come to tell you to use your light sympathetically, responsibly, for
Mm.
all of those good reasons that I outline at each stage.
Well, it's interesting because that your messaging in that and where you're starting from is a national park, and that's why we often use the terms restoring darkness and preserving night, and those are two different things, right? So preserving night is what you're doing in a national park, and it seems natural. It seems obvious. There isn't a lot of immediate pushback against that, and so the preserving night people, there's funding from in terms of the mine that applied for a permit to open, and then you guys get brought in, and everyone's on board. Okay, yeah, we want the mine here, but we want to keep the tranquility. We want to get rid of the light pollution. It's not as hard. The restoring darkness is going to require legislation. The restoring darkness is going to require enforcement along a carrot and a stick, and that's where we're trying to restore darkness where in our light polluted cities and landscapes. That's going to be harder. But they're both important, and right now, when you're preserving that night, you can bring people there and show them it. So you start to build a movement. You start to begin advocates. You start giving them statistics about light pollution. Why do we need so much light? I mean, we didn't have it in the past, and then you explain that it's not about being against electric light at night. That's not what we're talking about, and I love the way you're doing it, Mike. Before we close out, did I miss anything? Is there anything that you'd want to share with the listeners
No,
before we
I
sign
think
off?
that we often talk about one of my aims. So I started off, I think, in my bio it says, within the tourism department, in developing the Dark Sky Festival to help
Mm.
the rural economy. But it was always my aim to make sure that protecting dark skies was part of every department's role within the national park. And that
Hmm.
included our conservation department, it's conservation and climate change now, which actually it ticks both of those.
Mm.
It ticks both of those boxes. And often when we think about dark skies, we do think about access to seeing stars. But when we think seriously about nature and nocturnal connectivity and nocturnal habitats, um, yes, the stars are important to certain creatures, but darkness is the most important thing. So,
Hmm.
irrespective of whether it's a clear night or a cloudy night,
Hmm.
nature doesn't like artificial light at night. And actually, you can get a lot higher light readings when you've got low cloud because of that bounce back
Sure.
effect. And so, it almost doesn't matter from a nature perspective whether we're protecting it for stargazing or we're protecting it for nature. That is, there are multiple strings to this, and we've talked about that, but
They're
I didn't want
multifaceted.
to.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't want to kind of to lose that fact. In terms of legislation, we have got some legislation in the UK, but it's very, very rarely enforced. So
Mm.
we used to have the Environmental Health Act. It's now called the Cleaner Neighbourhoods Act. And within that, there's the ability of a local authority to enforce um, removal of nuisance lighting.
That's more about
But
light trespass, though, than light pollution, is it not?
yeah, it is. Typically, I won't say they always go hand in hand, but typically, if you've got a horrible floodlight that's mounted at 45 degrees, half of it onto your third of it onto your neighbour's property, a third of it into the sky, and a third
Sure.
of it onto where they actually want it. The issue with that is that the knowledge, the training, the information available, and also the manpower available is such that that is very, very rarely enforced. In fact, what we tend to get is we get people complain to their local council, who are the only people that can take enforcement action, and the local council says, "Oh, contact the national park; they know all about dark skies."
Yeah.
And the only teeth we've got is planning. The
Sure.
only authority we've got is in planning, which is new
Mm.
developments, not
Sure.
retrospectively on
The
existing development.
the problem with in Canada, you have your local and bylaw enforcers would be in charge of light trespass. They have no measurement tools, no training, right? They have one person that wants a light, the other person doesn't want the light. They're almost mitigating. They're almost like mitigating a dispute. Whereas if you leave your garbage outside in the summer, that's against bylaw number whatever, right? You can't. You have
Yeah.
to store your garbage inside of a bin with a locked thing on it, right? So the problem with enforcement is also technical, right? That we need to give the tools to the inspectors to be able to enforce it. They don't know what to do. They're more like it's tough for them to decide. But you know what? At the end of the day, there was that famous quote from the U.S. Supreme Court Justice when he was asked, "How do you know the difference between art and pornography?" He goes, "I can't technically describe it, but I know it when I see it." Right?
Yeah.
And I think light trespass is kind of like that as well, and light pollution is like that. Yeah, maybe we don't know how to measure it perfectly, but every people on that are at this point in this movement where you and I are, we know light pollution when we see it right away.
And
And
that's why I said to you previously, how do you measure it? Well,
yeah,
it's difficult to measure it, but you absolutely know a good example and a bad
yeah,
example.
for sure. Yep, I couldn't
I
agree
think
more.
I often wrap up with saying that we haven't yet had our plastics moment, and by
Yes,
that I mean that David Attenborough,
yeah,
that whatever it is on TV that really gets everybody, I should say, switched on, switched off, to the particular issue. But I think it's growing, and you said earlier on, momentum is growing.
yep.
We have. There's probably not a few weeks go by where there's not another article talking about the impacts of artificial light at night. We've got long-standing organisations like the Royal Horticultural Society,
Mm,
and for years they've been encouraging people to aesthetically light certain areas, maybe gardens or parks, etc. And now they've
mm.
got an area on their website which talks about if you want wildlife to thrive in those areas, you might want to think twice
Sure.
about that. And when we see big organisations like that, really starting to wake up to these things, then we know we're starting. We're starting to get there, and we just need more of that.
It's entering the cultural zeitgeist. We track um, all of the news related to dark sky preserves, darkness restoration, scientific studies. We post it on the restoringdarkness.com website. So if you're listening to this, go to restoringdarkness.com, click Darkness News, and you're going to see every article in the world in English posted there. I don't know if every single one, but a lot of them are. And then also on our LinkedIn. And we've started that, gosh, 2 years ago, Mike, and it's just more and more and more in the news every single week. We were thinking of starting a special newsletter just on this type of news because it's so voluminous now. It used to be a little tiny section in our lighting industry news brief, and now every week there's 10, 15 stories in that section from all over the English-speaking world. So you're absolutely right. You can feel the zeitgeist. The movement is moving into the cultural zeitgeist and starting to be absorbed. We haven't hit our plastics moments like you said, but it's coming soon. Greta Thunberg and all you climate changers, the darkness restoration, dark skies people are coming, and we are going to be the number. Because the thing I like about this movement, Mike, is it's solvable. It's not hopeless.
Just
it's not hopeless about it, right?
Absolutely. You think about you can be paralyzed into inaction with certain types of pollution.
Sure.
How do you solve microplastics in the oceans and the rivers, particulates in the air? Massive amounts of money will have to be spent to solve those problems. Whereas, generally speaking, controlling light saves money.
Yep. Payback.
Yep. And so, yeah, and I suppose the
That's
other
a
thing,
great point. What environmental issue do you know that you could put money at that will give you a 5 or 10-year payback in energy savings? Like
yeah,
there, this is a no-brainer for all, and also all the climate changers out there. If you guys like, this is the best way to do mitigation. I mean, it will work. It will reduce the energy consumption drastically if we do this correctly, especially if we're able to involve some of those advanced lighting controls, Mike, where we can then dim and warm and adjust lighting and give maybe the people in the neighborhood the ability to control it if they want it, and if it's off if they don't want it. I mean, there's really powerful tools available. We get moving. We're coming up on 50 minutes here. So I'm going to thank Mike Hawtin, North York Moors National Park. Thanks for joining us on the Restoring Darkness podcast.
Look no further for dark sky friendly products than Evluma. Since its first product launch, Evluma has carried one or more International Dark Sky Association certified models. If your customer cares about light pollution, suggest the OmniMax with shielding or the AreaMax with full cutoff to reduce uplight and glare. Evluma, illuminating the pursuit of darkness.